Alright, imagine you're in the medieval times. Who are some of the richest people that come to your mind? It's these lavish kings and noblemen, right? Well, kings and noblemen were not the only rich people back in medieval times. In fact, there was another group of folks that made quite a bit of money back then, and these were financially savvy investors. Of course, the concept of investing as we know it today with stocks and bonds and complex financial instruments, these didn't exist back then. However, there were opportunities, like a lot of investment opportunities for those looking to make a fortune. So whether you're an average Joe or a tradesman or a craftsman or even a middle class person with a small chunk of change, there were lots of opportunities for investments back then. So the question is, how did investing even work in medieval times? So hit that subscribe button if you haven't already and let's get into it. The first way that people made their money was through real estate. So if you're thinking in feudal times the king actually technically owned all the land, you're right. So the king could technically take away all the land from his subjects whenever he wished. However, this was rarely done in practice because too much of it would spark a rebellion from the subjects. And it was in the interest of the king to have a respectable balance over there. So there was a system in place. These lords would keep the king in check and stop him from being tyrannical. And the lords in turn would be kept in check by the courts through a number of laws. So all of this was present to prevent the kings and the noblemen from arbitrarily taking away land from commoners. And because of this, there was a degree of certainty that the land entitled to a commoner was going to remain with them and with their heirs. And this system paved the way for commerce because people started to pay money for land entitlement. In fact, medieval real estate market, particularly for agricultural land, had so much money coming in that a bubble formed. That's right, there was a real estate bubble in the medieval times. And that bubble burst a generation after the Black Death decimated Europe. So real estate investments started way earlier than you think. Alright, the next option for investments was through trade partnerships. But this was not only for kings and for noblemen. It was probably not for the average Joe either. It was meant more for people in the middle class, with people who have an existing amount of money already. So someone like that could look into investing in trade partnerships. However, the way in which it would operate back then is very different from how it works today. A helpful way to look at this would be to think of it as a form of venture capital. So one party would provide the money and the other party would take that money and use it in a high risk but high return business. In the Islamic world, this contract was called the Qirad. So this would later influence the creation of a similar system in Italy called the Commenda. So what would happen is you as the investor would provide the money and your partner would then hire a ship and make a dangerous, perilous journey overseas to buy exotic goods. Upon return, those goods would be sold in the local market for a very high profit. You'd obviously have to pay a lot of taxes on the profits that you made, and then whatever was left over, you'd split with your partner. Now, if we look to Portugal and Spain, these kinds of ventures were actually highly profitable for the entrepreneurs, because the king, as the investor, would only take 20% as a tax, and that's a pretty low amount for that time, and the rest would be split amongst the partners. It was a pretty lucrative initiative, it was highly volatile and very dangerous, but it still brought in a lot of profits. No wonder so many were willing to risk everything to cross oceans and reach India for a lot of these trades. Alright, the next is good old-fashioned money lending. So in more commercialized parts of the medieval world, people who already had some money could actually grow their wealth through money lending. And just like you guessed it, the way in which this worked is slightly different from how it works today. In today's day and age, you pay interest on the money that you borrow, but in medieval times, the interest charges were actually cleverly disguised in various ways. So let's look at Italy for a second. One common method to lend money was to farmers or craftsmen, and the way in which the money was lent was that instead of taking some interest, they would get rights to purchase their goods at a negotiated price. So what would end up happening is those goods were eventually bought at a very large discount because they were giving the money against it. And in the future, they'd sell these products at a fair market value, which was usually much higher than what they paid for it. And let me tell you, this method made a lot of families rich beyond measure. So yeah, money lending was a pretty big part of medieval society. The next is guilds. So this was an investment option for craftsmen and artisans to help improve their financial status. So before industrialization, quality work equipment was actually very expensive for the average craftsman. So they needed better tools to create better products. So that's where the guilds came in. Guilds were kind of like an investment society. So they'd pool their money together and jointly open up workshops that were then used by all members of that guild. So now all of a sudden they had access to all these good equipment and materials that they could use to create better products which they could sell. And creating a guild would actually pay dividends in other ways as well. If a membership grew large enough, they could actually form monopolies, and they would reduce the supply of the thing that they were selling and thereby inflate their prices. So they were used in nefarious ways as well. These guilds would also pressure the local lords or mayors to restrict or raise taxes on competitor goods so that their own goods would have higher value. So it wasn't a very ethical way of investing, but it was definitely an investment option for craftsmen back in the day. So, contrary to popular belief that society and people back in medieval times were primitive and that things were not sophisticated, well, that couldn't be farther from the truth. The reality is that it was a highly dynamic time in our history with lots of entrepreneurial energy. This was a period of immense innovations in all aspects of society, including in the financial industry, leading to ample opportunities for those who were savvy enough to spot them. This meant that people beyond noblemen and kings were able to get wealthy. Alright, so while we're on the subject of finance and medieval history, another topic that's super interesting is how bankruptcy worked in medieval times. I actually made a video about that a few weeks ago, so check it out here. Drop a like on this video if you've enjoyed it, and thank you so much for watching so far, and I'll see you soon.